Today this is the last day. To me it's kind of unbelievable, it ran very fast. We will today mostly sort of summarize what we were talking about for the rest of the week. There's going to be maybe some new ideas, new thoughts, but we are going to be mostly sort of looking forward. Until now we were trying to learn some new skills. Hopefully you now have at your disposal some material you can work with and some codes you can adapt, potentially apply them on your own data in the ways which we can't probably even imagine, in the new ways and new cool ways. But today we are going to be mostly kind of recapitulating and as I said, sort of looking forward to see what can be done tomorrow. And of course, remember on Monday we started talking about, a point on Monday was that we talk about speech. All this time, through the week, we were talking about speech recordings, ideally, for some of us, machine learning minded people, raw recordings, just waveforms, appropriately sort of, with appropriate metadata, so that we know what those recordings are. But minimal processing by hand. A few times I use the phrase that this is a type of work for kind of lazy phoneticians who don't want to be annotating, don't want to be doing some sort of very deep informed analysis. And it's not only about laziness, it's about trying to sort of remove all possible theoretical biases from our analysis. Of course, it's not always fully, or it's never fully achievable, but for example, we have to label the files by the language. Language already is a theoretical construct, or even by a dialect. That's also a theoretical construct. Like if we have to decide on what dialect we label. So, like I come from a relatively small town, but I lived in Dublin for many years, over a decade, and Dublin, like many other places on the British Isles, has very complicated sort of dialect structure itself. There are at least 4 discernible dialects, because there is sort of, even within the city, there is sort of geographical distinction, North Dublin and South Dublin, which is based on some particular historical sort of division of the town, nothing to do with the division of Ireland, much longer, 500 years ago, and then they have the sort of socio-economic dialects as well, the sort of middle class dialect and working class dialect. And these two things interact. So if we want to do some analysis, for example, which would be another super interesting thing for me in particular, of the Hibernian Irish English, put the label that somebody is from Dublin is a huge underspecification. So all of these type of things are theoretically decided. They are decided in advance. What type of data we collect, how much information and all that. But nevertheless, this is sort of still working with as little theoretical assumptions as possible. If you want to study tones, for example, then you have to, in some language, and you of course want to sort of annotate them and label and figure out where the tones are, you always have to make the theoretical assumption that there are tones and that the syllable is a carrier of the tones, or the vowel is a carrier of the tones. And when I label something as a tone, like T1 or something like that, then I have to decide what type of other information I include there. What type of information I include in the label. So do I say that this is a T1, tone 1, following tone 2, as opposed to tone 1 following tone 3? Or do I ignore this type of information? Do I say that is a tone 1 at the end of the phrase, as opposed to tone 1 at the beginning of the phrase? Or do I decide to ignore this type of effect? So again, this is a theoretical assumption we have to make when we are analyzing any type of data. And we do it routinely. There is nothing wrong about that in principle, We always have to make theoretical assumptions, but it's good to be aware of them. And this type of analyzing sort of raw data, it's requires fewer theoretical assumptions than the others. So it's a little bit sort of more theory independent type of inquiry than the others. So we are trying to minimize the theoretical load, almost starting from scratch, almost starting, as I said, like this again another metaphor, almost started looking at the languages in the world from the eyes of the Martian who just landed on the planet, crash landed somewhere and starts trying to make sense of these strange species which are everywhere, as opposed to many other much more interesting species which are much more rare. So that was the first day essentially. We kind of talked, we tried to kind of move your attention to speech. And then on the second day we talked about how to get our hands on some sort of speech sample. We talked about databases and how databases are organized and all of type of things. And I hope that we have learned a little bit, even throughout our own preparation of the database, what are the steps. You have to have the meta file, what type of information you log there, what type of information you store, what type of information you try not to store, what type of information you store securely, what type of things you can share, all of these super important aspects. Then we talked about sort of machine learning. Two disguises I'll probably talk about in more. One which is more machine learning descended from statistical analysis, like many sort of classifiers, for example, which is a machine learning which has a relatively machine learning type, which are relatively strict algorithms, which are fit to some sort of database. And then on Thursday we talked about the other type of machine learning, which is a little bit more flexible. It's a machine learning where you train, flexible only in the sense that the networks behind it are way more complicated. So the mathematical functions which you fit are maybe better at fitting, but more difficult to actually know, to sort of reverse engineer. While when you build a LDA classifier, LDA classifier, QDA classifier, you know very well how the algorithm works. It's an algorithm with relatively few parameters, so you know what your results really mean, although the fit might not be necessarily so faithful. Well, in the deep learning machine algorithm, your fit might be excellent, and usually is, because these are sort of utilitarian speech technology applications. They are developed by extremely clever engineers to work. So you get a very, very good fit, but you don't necessarily know how to interpret the fit. And so we talked about those, and we talked about applications to different type of typological questions, analytical questions to by these two types of algorithms. What did we do yesterday? That was one of those days, no? I think I got there. So, and then we had some hands-on work. So we did fit some type of classifiers, the other type of technology which also contains classifiers. Actually, the pipeline we ran through yesterday through a tutorial contains two classifiers on the top of each other, if you remember. There's first the language identification model. It's a classifier itself, and then we apply the LDA classifier on the results. So it's sort of two classifiers on the top of each other, just to make sure that we classify things well. So yes, as I said, today we are gonna go slowly and give some thoughts to all of the things which we learned. I would really today, I'm hoping to run today's session with Priyanku more as a discussion. I would greatly appreciate your input. We've said most of our stuff which we know. Now it's sort of to debate and to try to figure out. I have sort of convinced Priyanku that it might be a good way to do a little bit today of an exercise of the type which we do regularly in Finland, where the teaching, the sort of educational sort of practices are becoming more and more interactive. So at some point today, don't be scared, I will stop talking and I will ask you to maybe divide two little groups and debate what you have heard, some of your ideas, in particular something relevant for you, your projects. What do you think and what the others think about that, and what the others might help you, and then we can discuss for 20 minutes whatever half an hour, depending on how much there is to discuss, and then you will sort of tell us more or less in few words. There's no need to prepare some formal report. In few words, what you discussed, and maybe the others can contribute to that. For the online participants, that would be the time when we are going to be here, Abhijit, Tuukka, Priyanko, and myself, and we can talk to the online participants in the meantime. It's more difficult in Teams to divide more participants into groups. I'm sure that it's somehow possible, but maybe it's going to be easier for them because the direct debate with the online participants was much less than the direct debate with the offline participants, so we might try to sort of compensate. And so if you have any questions, if I'm looking to the left and back, then I'm looking at the online participants list. If you have any questions or any thoughts, please think about that and try to, in about, I don't know, an hour, we will hopefully have time for that. So I'm going to just, there's going to be a lot of repetition today. It's essentially only repetition today. So, yeah. So we have, as I just was saying, we have covered sort of two basic types of machine learning in some sense. The things which are sort of type of fits and analyses which are derived from directly from the analyzed data with the relatively rigid algorithms. The fit is directly sort of interpretable on the data, like PCA and all sort of classifiers, QDA, LDA. Maybe the random forests type of classifiers can all be broadly included in this group. There is not a very straight boundary between those two. Anybody can argue their case that my favorite classifier actually belongs to the other group, and I have very little to actually the argumentation. But very broadly, it might be good to think about those things. So, these type of algorithms provide, as Priyanko put it, sort of informed analysis. It's analysis of the material where we, first of all, the questions are explicit, the questions are theoretically informed, and data are also processed in the theoretically informed manner. We extract some particular features, some Foreman features for the vowels. There is a theory behind why the Formans actually represent vowels. There is a sort of theoretical and practical concerns. How do we extract the Formans from the vowels? Because all of these, speech sounds are kind of living things. It's very difficult to say where some R in some utterance starts and ends, and when it becomes the real R as opposed to some slide from the previous vowel and all that. So all of these things, where we extract the F0, where we extract the Formans, all of those things are. So we have to make a decision, and we make the decision based on our knowledge, our expertise, and theoretical understanding of the field. These work very well on relatively small data sets. They work very well on big data sets, by the way, of course. So this is a praise rather than they only use these on small databases. No. They use excellently well on the big databases, but they also work very well on the relatively small databases. There are sort of many, I guess all of these type of classifiers, for example, are actually, you will learn them, details of them, in your stats classes, right? So these are statistical tools. So these are sort of all based on some sort of analysis of variance. Statistics is always analysis of variance. That should sort of ring the bell. We are here to analyze linguistic diversity. So surely statistics is the right place to go, because statistics is all about the analysis of variance. It's all about the analysis of, we have the idea of some value of some particular variable, the pitch height, the tone 1 pitch in Angami, and then we record it and we kind of treat. We are trying to find this truth value, being aware that there is a lot of variance around that. So we're trying to sort of, remove the noise, as it were. That's what. And these type of classifiers do more or less the same thing, or are based on the same type of principles. PCA itself, for example, is trying to maximize the variance alongside the different dimensions. LDA is trying to minimize the in-class variance and maximize the between classes variance. It's all about statistical concept of variance. Variance just means sort of, the kind of, how far you are from middle, or the real value, the estimate, as it is called. Well, the real value we are trying to estimate using statistical analysis. Of course, we could start on Monday again and try to retell this entire story in the Bayesian way of thinking. We would probably use quite a lot of the same statistical methods. We'll just talk about them a little bit differently. We talk about beliefs and about the evidence and all that. It would be another fascinating run. But here we were sort of, when we talked about statistics, we talk about this in more of the sort of frequentist, more still probably predominant way of token analysis. I guess when you are my age and giving this talk, you probably will say that, we could do the same in the frequentist way, but we kind of did it in Bayesian, which is obviously the more prevalent because that's how the trend goes. The Bayesian way of thinking is sort of becoming to dominate the statistical parallel. These type of classifiers and the statistics-based sort of systems are usually very effective for the kind of controlled, targeted data. Again, these data which we somehow labeled based on some theories, which we extracted some features, which we use the theoretical knowledge to analyze, to pre-analyze. And then we can sort of try to find those kind of correct right values of different measures or whatever we are interested in. The other type of machine learning methods which we covered quite extensively are the deep learning based methods. These are the methods which we, as sort of humanists, as linguists and phoneticians, sort of are taking back from the technologists, from the engineers. We helped them to build them, and now we're taking them back. So they are sort of cashing on our debt, on the debt. These usually, good thing about them, that usually these many of these things come pre-trained on the unimaginable amount of data for us. When we, as phoneticians, when we record 30 people doing something in 5 conditions of some sort and 10 repetitions of each, we consider that like the huge database. Almost no reviewer, unless you are trying to publish in some psychological journals, almost no reviewer will tell you like, go and collect more data. In phonetics, it's like, wow, this is amazing. Of course, these are drops compared to the amount of data these type of algorithms were fitted to. Again, these are, as you probably know, we didn't sort of take it completely, but deep learning is also essentially a branch of statistics. There's a lot of stochastic processes going on. Very often, we didn't sort of really talk about that, but very often they are very explicitly statistical. So, for example, when we were talking about the speech synthesizers, what the speech synthesizer can generate the waveform of some sort. What in fact they generate most of the time, very often, or for many intermediate steps, they generate probabilities over some possible set of, let's say, samples or possible sets of renditions and things like that. So they're also probabilistic machines. So these are also essentially the very large and complex statistical models which are fit to data. Again, apart from that, your LDA might contain altogether maybe dozens of parameters, while some of these out-to-vex things or large language models contains billions of parameters. So this is just this is the order of like several order of magnitude different type of beast. They of course require relatively large corpora. Sure, certainly these foundational models like out-to-vex and the language identification things or speech synthesizers require a huge amount of data, huge corpora. Luckily, as we argued, and I'll sort of a little bit talk about that more, or yes, I'll talk about it a little bit more. For this analysis, we could get away with relatively much less, in particular because these things are pre-trained. In particular, when we want to do the analysis, which uses these pre-trained foundational models. If we want to build a machine learning model, which, like, for example, some generative models, which we have to train from scratch ourselves, then we need a lot of data. But if we use these pre-trained, sort of pre-fitted, is that a word? Pre-fitted knowledge, then we can actually, for analysis, do it on comparatively smaller amount of data. Of course, and I will be talking about this again, so again reiterating, because we were talking about that quite a lot, these are only really useful for particular type of questions. There are most questions we come up with, it's not maybe the ideal methodology to apply to. I'll talk about it. Some of you come to me every now and then and ask me some of the questions. Many of them I would say like, this is cool, let's do that. But then there are some questions where I have to say like, I'm not sure. But that of course just means that I'm not sure. And it's up to you or up to other people to sort of be imaginative. We had managed to address quite a few questions which we didn't know that we could, you know. So this is an open field. By the way, I actually don't have a slide about this, but I just now remembered, or earlier remembered when I was sitting here, that on the day one, as I said, I tried to get everybody thinking about speech, as opposed to, let's say, text-based corpora, or as opposed to some sort of syntactic, formal type of analysis, some type of, grammatical features of some sort and all that. All the methods we were presenting were sort of fine-tuned to the speech material, because we are speech scientists. We are in a different camp, The people who work with the text, they are them for us, And like, of course, privately we are friends, but officially cross the corridor kind of thing. But many of these systems are also extremely effective in analyzing text-based material. You just need slightly different, of course, corpora, maybe slightly different way of thinking, and they are faced with different challenges when you analyze text-based corpora. One of the most obvious of the challenges, of course, is the script. I don't have to tell the Indians how many scripts there are out there in the world, because my feeling is that about half of Priyanka will know precisely, half of the sort of sound-based scripts actually are used in India, and the rest of the world just basically just about scrapes about the rest. But of course this is a little bit of a challenge when you want to compare the text from many languages and they come in different scripts. This is not an unsurmountable challenge. There are ways, very clever ways, using things like machine translation, for example, where when you translate from, Telugu to Hindi, which use different scripts, you can have the machine translation system, which reads the Telugu script and produces the Hindi script, and somewhere in between, these scripts sort of disappear inside the machine. There is but there is still a representation of the language, which you can use in terms of some sort of typological comparison. How much this is for them, for the text-based linguists, to kind of decide how much this type of representation, how much information it actually contains about the script, how biased is about the script. Because the other possibility is to sort of transcribe to translate all the different orthographies to some common orthography. But then, of course, you have to decide how to do that. Do it sound-based, and of course, then there are all sort of crazy issues with sort of arbitrariness of orthographies. Just take English. The sequence of characters. There's so much kind of arbitrary historical layers that it's what you might find that the English just simply don't know how to spell, essentially. That might be one of the things, because the spelling has nothing to do with the language. But anyway, but these are challenges to be faced by the others. But there is also very, very lively field of doing the text-based comparative analysis of corpora and many things like that. We have colleagues in Helsinki University. There's a language technology group, and they are again one of the sort of forerunners in this sort of text-based, machine translation-based typological analysis. Let's go back to speech. Let's forget the text thing. Let's go back to speech. So a little bit, let's talk about some good and sort of not so good points of these two approaches. There is a thumb up, and it's slightly different rendition to what I put in there. I'm hoping that some of these renditions with these, are not gonna turn out to something really strange. But so these classifiers have been proven again and again to be very successful to address many phenomena. For example, like Priyanku was saying, his group of people here have applied all sort of classifiers on a lot of very interesting questions about the, Northeast Indian languages and many other languages, and so it works very well. It works super well. So, for example, when you have extracted some sort of set of features, a smallish set of features, I mean smallish because you have to extract it, that might require some manual labor. You can characterize whatever different classes of the analyzed material. You can assign you can assign the labels to them, explicit labels. That's one of the points, So you have fitted your classifier model on a bunch of languages in terms of what, for example, rhythm class they fall into. And then you have the new language, and you can sort of estimate, based on some carefully designed features, to what rhythm class that language might fall, or that particular dialect. Or do all the dialects of some particular language uniformly fall and happily fall into one rhythm class, or will they start being difficult and sort of span among multiple rhythm classes? All sort of things can be super well addressed using these methods. You can check how many different sort of characteristics interact with each other. This is what I was saying. Dialect and rhythm class, how they interact. We can see that this one falls to this dialect based on some particular classifier analysis, and falls into this type of rhythm class. Is it always that they fall into rhythm class, or is it some particular other things which kind of be shifting it left and right? Again, I'm not a linguist, so my linguistic knowledge is more sort of implicit, so that's why I often use the examples from my mother tongue, because essentially my last, I guess, formal class I've taken in formal linguistics was in my high school, my last Slovak class, so I never really studied linguistics. I studied math, I studied logic, which is a weird branch of linguistics, if you know what I mean, because it studies the properties of mathematical language, essentially. But I never really studied linguistics apart from that. I did study some phonetics, of course, and a lot of cognitive science. There was always some linguistics, and I read books, but I don't have really huge amount of examples. So in Slovak we have this thing that I probably told you that in the western side of the country there is one type of word lexical stress pattern, and in the other side of the country there is another type of lexical stress pattern, and they are both sort of borrowed from the neighbors, from the relative neighbors, and then you can look, I would love to do that, what happened in between, because there's a bit of a mystery. People in middle, they kind of use both of those patterns, but it doesn't seem to become sort of lexically based, so even the people in the middle don't seem to be using the different patterns in terms of that some words would have used that pattern and some words used that pattern, so it would become sort of stress, like linguistically contrasting information in terms of stress. It seems to be that they use it pragmatically. In some situations they would use that way, and in some situations they would use that way. So those would be things which you can study exactly using this type of data. You could build the classifiers based on these particular features and then feed them with the samples from somewhere in between and see where they classify and in what particular context they classify in one and the other. Of course, importantly, these type of analyses yield interpretable results. So if I run this type of analysis, I would, by the time I'm finished with that, I would have to spend a lot of effort preparing the data and conceptualize the data and figuring out how to measure this type of, you know, stress patterns, how to kind of quantify them. I would probably have to do a lot of manual work. But when I'm done, I would know straight away what really is happening and why. So maybe on the backside for the what is it? No, backside. That's the wrong term. Well, the sort of downside of these it's the right term, but for something else. The downside of the classifiers is that they usually require a relatively big amount of manual work. They're sort of annotating, labeling, thinking, you know, arguing what would be the good ways of putting things, what would be the good ways of analyzing, whether we are going to extract F0 from the middle third of the vowel, or from the 20th to 80th percentile, or just from one value, and why, and all of those things. That requires a lot of thinking, effort, kind of discussions, and we've all been through these type of discussions and the arguments for and against everything. Of course, what comes from these discussions is hopefully the well thought out, controlled and carefully crafted data. Also, I've been saying this few times, this inevitably, because the way how we design our data set comes from a lot of these discussions and expertise and maybe trials and errors. The results and the entire process is theory driven. We have to have hypotheses. Hypotheses are often sort of pre-given. For example, we might classify things to 3 different rhythm classes, like stress timed, syllable timed, and mora timed. And then at the end, and we feed it some new language or something, new data, carefully drafted data, and then we get an answer that this is stress timed, or syllable timed, or mora timed. But what if it's something else timed? There's no option really. We will not get that answer. We can maybe interpret the data if there's something which doesn't fit really in either of them, get really randomly classified. We might start thinking to come up with a new class for it. But then again, that's another theoretical decision. We come up with the 4th class and start adding, start investigating again. But usually we are not asking, we are not sort of exploring, we are drawing maps in some sense. If you have, if you have theoretical based studies, always prone to all sort of biases. History of science is full of all sort of biases, which have were imposed on the theories. We can talk about that for hours and hours and hours. Many of those biases were rather tragic and have done a lot of harm. Of course, everything is theoretically biased, so it doesn't mean that theoretical bias is something necessarily tragic. It may be many of those theoretical biases were also extremely instrumental in coming up with the amazing stuff. But the theoretical bias there always is. The good thing about deep learning is that it works. That's when we started this exercise. When was it? 10 years ago or more over than that? We actually first wrote a proposal without trying it for this project. And then, surprisingly to us, we got the money. And then we went okay, will it even work? We had no clue. We didn't try it before. And it did work. And it does work, and it works more and more. And I hope we convinced you that even these deep learning methods sort of produce interesting results and work. Sometimes almost disturbingly so. Let's just think about our little corpus we designed. How well it worked. It's almost sort of spooky in some sense. As you saw with our corpus, these methods don't really require any sort of annotations. It was minimal manual work done on those. Okay, you did some manual, chopping those utterances into those recordings into utterances. But of course, that can be also automated. And as a matter of fact, in particular, these WAF2WEC based analyses. They don't really even require the unit for which we can pool the information from WAF to WEC to be linguistically meaningful. It doesn't have to be an utterance. In many cases, when Tuka we were analyzing some big databases, Tuka just chops it to like 6 seconds, more or less, and that might work as well. Maybe remove some silence. So it much less load of any sort of manual processing before that, or any sort of signal processing. Usually, as we were arguing a few times and talking about that, if anything, signal processing is kind of harmful for these type of applications because it might leave some sort of trace. And the one thing we have to be kind of very aware of always, you have to be very consistent with all of these steps. That's why it's good that machines do that, because machines sort of impose that consistency. So we always try to write a sort of scripts for everything rather than doing manually, because then you know when you run the script, it knows that everything is being done more or less consistently. Well, very consistently unless you have a bug in a script, of course. Performance, as we saw as well, although they come with the massive pre-training, these type of systems, they, again, this is empirical fact rather than something given, something which we found out on the way, they perform well for untrained languages. So they learn to generalize. Of course, that's one of the core requirements from any good machine learning, that it generalizes. There are all sort of machine learning tricks and techniques how to ensure that your application generalizes. Generalizing means that it will do well for unseen data. When you do the speech synthesis system, of course, for example, you train it on a lot of pairs of text and sound. But of course, you want it to generalize. You want it to synthesize the speech for the text you'd never seen before. It would be a lame speech synthesizer, which could only repeat what it has heard. So that would not generalize. Happens as well. When it happens, you have to start redesigning your network. So the ability to generalize, of course, is sort of really core thing. But in these type of LID models, the language the demand or the requirement to generalize to the languages on which it wasn't trained is not necessarily the foremost thing in the minds of the designers. What they, of course, want to achieve is that it will generalize on the samples from the languages which it didn't see. So, it will classify any sort of English utterance as English, any sort of Hindi utterance as Hindi, but not necessarily that it classifies in any way some utterance from, let's say, Angami language, which it didn't see in the training as anything. But surprisingly, some portions of course, it cannot even classify Angami as an Angami because it doesn't have the, the bulb at the end which will light up for the Angami language. You only have those 107 bulbs, which will tell you, which will light up when it hears a language. These are, of course, no bulbs. These are some vectors and the probabilities and all that. So it doesn't have the one kind of value for Angami, so it cannot predict that it's Angami. But we know that somewhere some intermediate representations contain a lot of interesting knowledge, typological knowledge, also about the languages which it didn't see. So it generalizes well in that sense as well. These, of course, as we saw, are not necessarily, well, we can think about that. It's going to be, I'm going to continue on that on the following slide, but we found these type of analysis particularly good for generating new hypotheses. This is like sort of relatively rough exploration. This is like sending drone somewhere to look around roughly. What's there? What might be there interesting? Before you send some sort of explorers who will start, taking the samples and this is like, sending some sort of satellite to orbit the moon, as they did in the 60s, before they let anybody to land there. We are working towards the landing as well a little bit, but this is much more sort of exploratory, hypothesis generating exercise as we see it. Now, there are many downsides of deep learning. It requires larger amount of data. That is fine because it sort of compensates, large amount of data, less work. Let's work with them. Usually, for the sort of standard phonetic analyses is not necessarily always the bottleneck or the problem to collect a lot of data. Sometimes, of course, it's a problem, like in particular field research. Like you have to go to the village and you have to find the people to record. You have to find the people who are, we were discussing that before, you have to find the people who are sort of relevant speakers of the given dialect for your type of question. And, so it might be difficult to collect the data. But by and large, in sort of standard phonetic analysis, it's actually not a huge problem. There's plenty of undergrads around you can put to the recording booth and record them. But of course, the more data you have, if you have to do annotating, extracting features, the more work and longer it takes. Very soon you start running out of undergrads to do that work because you need the fully trained and people with expertise. So, yes, of course, we as phoneticians, we know we spend a lot of time sort of annotating. One of the perks of the academic career, in particular for a phonetician, is that when you, that's maybe one of the motivations for phoneticians in academia, is that when you sort of start climbing on the sort of career ladder, hierarchical ladder, the less annotation you need to do, you know. I haven't annotated a file for maybe 10 years. Of course, I have to do all the other, administrative crazy stuff where I'm completely out of my depth. I really don't know what to do. But annotating, I'm saving on that. So if you're, ever wondering why would I publish and apply for lectureships and later on professorships, this is one of the perks. Now, the deep learning is, of course, as we were discussing that extensively, only really good for some particular type of questions. We will talk about those questions in a minute, This is something good to remember, that not every question we can address as yet with our skills and knowledge by these type of methods. We are particularly good at measuring all sort of distances, but not much else, as we will see. Also, results are sort of rather difficult to interpret. This is putting it kind of relatively mildly. They very often cannot be interpreted in terms of standard phonetic, phonological, prosodic, linguistic features. It's hard to say. We know that these dialects are further apart than these other two dialects, but we don't necessarily know why and what makes them further apart. This is also a theoretical question. I think we will be talking about that in a minute.